Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to another Kepler Teacher Live. And we're here today with Mary Pat Rogers, who is a teacher in New Mexico and a teacher with Kepler. Welcome, Mary Pat.
Hi, thanks, Jeffrey. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very pleased you're here, and pleased you're here with the class that you're teaching. You're teaching one class with us, and the class that you're teaching is so exotically titled. So we're talking about. I mean, it was just a trajectory in itself. A journey to Aristotle, from the Greeks to Venus and back again. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, about the trajectory of your class, but why that title grabbed you, or why you grabbed that title.
Okay, yeah. So I have a background in rhetoric, and anyone who's able to look at the course will see that we're reading some pretty old, a bunch of old dead guys from starting with Homer and working our way towards Aristotle. But I feel like that sometimes, particularly as you start to get into Aristotle, it gets really dry, and students begin to lose interest in all of the categorizations and just the listing out that Aristotle does. And so you really need something that's beautifully written to recapture some interest there. And having just recently finished the trilogy, I think a couple of years ago, just really finished working through it, and was struck at every turn at how rhetorically based a lot of the story is, particularly the last two books of the space trilogy. And so
yeah, you said the trilogy. I was like, well, hold on, which trilogy? Yeah, so the space trilogy is the Venus part of your class title.
Yes, that is the Venus part. And of course, in the trilogy, we start out heading to Mars. We go to Mars and then to Venus, and then we're back on Earth. And that's really, the back again is really, we're back on Earth as far as the title of the course goes. And being able to look at what Lewis has done with words, particularly the way that characters speak to one another or try to convince one another of things, that we can see rhetoric classically, like as we know it classically, playing out in this really beautiful and interesting way. And so I do want students to understand that you don't have to only read speeches necessarily in order to have a grasp on rhetoric or to be able to be interested in rhetoric. Like, it's not just about political speeches or that really high-minded oratory that you often see, and that in any piece of literature or like a historical work, you find rhetorical measures being taken in order to move the whole thing along.
Yeah, and rhetoric infuses any sort of communication that we have. There's a competitive speech class coming out this summer,
Yeah.
but in the description of that class, I mean, it's a competitive speech class, so it's not only rigorous but very structured. Even within that, winsome is one of the words that that is prioritized, and how that teacher is approaching it. So whatever kind of communication you're engaging in rhetoric. There's no way around that.
Right. That is correct. Yeah.
So, when I saw the title from Greece, okay, and I'm looking at the reading list, okay, great, and Venus, okay, well, the space trilogy right there, and as I was reading through, I was like, is this going to be super wild? Is back again going to be The Hobbit? And I was really struggling to see like how but yeah. But the connection there from Aristotle to Lewis actually makes good sense to me. It was the Hobbit part that was throwing me, and it's not there, of course.
Yeah, in my I thought I was being so clever and presented the title to Kepler, and they said, "Oh yeah, great title." And then about a week later, I looked at it and went, "Oh my gosh."
Well, you're stuck with it now.
Like, what in the world? We're not bringing the Hobbit into it, or the Silmarillion or the Fellowship. All of that's for another class. That's for someone else to tackle.
Right. And in fact, so this is, I find it so interesting, the way it's presented, and then the reading list. So the reading list is the Iliad, then Gorgias, Phaedrus, Aristotle's Rhetoric, and then 2 of the Space Trilogy books. But it's not a literature class. Maybe you could talk about how these readings, particularly the C.S. Lewis readings, this is what I'd really like to hear about, especially how they are for rhetorical instruction and enrichment.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that the course will be structured is that the first part of the semester, or the first semester of the course, we're going to be dealing pretty heavily with just Greeks. We'll start with Homer, Plato. If we have time, we'll get into a little bit of Aristotle. But Aristotle's Rhetoric is a teeny tiny little book. It's dense. There's a lot to kind of slog through. And I love Aristotle. I think he has made a fantastic work, but like I said, it gets a little dry. And so we will be having had the background that we'll get from Homer and Plato, we will talk about Aristotle and Lewis alongside each other. And so those readings will happen simultaneously.
That's cool.
So that, because one of the things that Aristotle I think assumes in his work, and he mentions it a couple of times, but really does assume, is something from Plato, that you have to understand the soul that you are talking to. And if you can't do that, then you're not going to be successful as a rhetor. And I think that Lewis gives some fantastic examples, particularly in Paralandra, but of the Green Lady, or the lady and Ransom, and then our some of our other characters. I don't want to spoil it too much for the folks that haven't read it, but the interactions that they have and the way that they speak to one another and the intent of those words is such a strong image for what Plato is talking about in Phaedrus, but also what Aristotle then assumes will be true of anyone that's speaking. And so Aristotle and Lewis will be read alongside each other. And had a moment of panic a few weeks ago. You guys did another live, and someone was talking about how Augustinian C.S. Lewis is, and I thought, oh man, like here we go. I don't know enough to disagree with that. I mean, I'm sure he's right. But then that I think that brings up questions, at least for me as a teacher, of well, then how do you merge Lewis and Aristotle well,
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that you're not just cherry picking
Right.
something from Lewis that you're like, well, that's clever, like,
Yeah.
and just making sure that I'm really doing justice to both texts
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously.
Well, it's so interesting to me how many Kepler teachers are fascinated with Lewis, in particular the Space Trilogy. It's come up 3 or 4 times, and there actually is a summer course being offered that's apologetics through the Space Trilogy. So at least one other person is seeing rhetoric in, like, rhetoric instruction in the
Yes.
Space Trilogy, which I'm absolutely loving. And it is funny to see how the Kepler faculty, if we can use that term, there are a lot of common things revolving around in our little world. Carla Memot, one of our teachers, comments, "I find it interesting how many classes have a concentration on travel and the journey." The Hobbit is in her class. There's actually a travel literature course as well. Maybe talk a little bit about the trajectory of, I know we talked about, the title itself carries us somewhere, but your course objectives are very, like, straight up. This is a rhetoric class, right? You want to be able to define rhetoric, identify the basic elements and structure of rhetoric, recognize and mimic. And I think actually, I love that you chose the word mimic there, the classical rhetorical schemes and tropes, and then identify rhetoric as a culminating art. An art which we as Christians have a responsibility to command, just as Christ did. So this is obviously where you want the students to end up. Maybe comment on how, those last few months, what students will be doing to reach, at least within the year, that culmination.
Yeah. So that last objective for sure is a lifelong pursuit. We'll start there.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an incredibly high view of language and the way that it is used. And so as far as the trajectory of the course, kind of in that mindset, I really want the students to be able to see language not as simply a tool, and being able to combine Aristotle with Lewis, then that you are practicing something every single day that has the power to create and to destroy, and that the way that we manage that is incredibly important, but that we ought to be trying to attain an ideal every single day. And that, my hope is that as far as the trajectory goes, that it's a sobering element for the students.
Yeah, so sobering, and why would a student need to be sobered, and what good would that do?
Well, I think a lot of students come into a rhetoric class or a speech class or competitive speech or whatever it is, thinking, all right, I just have to say the right things in order to get the right grade. And it's been such a joy in teaching. I taught one of the spring courses with Kepler. It's been such a joy working with students there, but also conversing back and forth with a couple of teachers, that the grade is really never the point.
And it's so hard to convince people of that.
Yeah, it is.
It really is.
Yeah, shockingly hard. And that you can check all of the boxes, you can do all of the things and do them correctly, and maybe even do them beautifully, and have missed the entire point. And in my philosophy of teaching, we talk about my desire I don't want to produce the clever devils that C.S. Lewis talks about.
I actually had that queued up and ready to show on screen.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. Oops, I guess it didn't show the whole thing. Here we go. There we go.
Oh, yeah. So it is just in talking back and forth with several kind of powerhouse folks in the classical world. Some of the things that I teach, I've been told several times, like, you are playing a dangerous game. And I am fully aware that I am playing a dangerous game. And having seen some of the output of that game, I take very seriously the sobering of a student, because they do come in and they think, okay, I just have to say the right thing. I have to make the teacher happy. If I do the rhetorical schemes beautifully, then she'll give me an A and I can say whatever I want.
Right. And that attitude is Lewis's clever devils.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that is the opposite of the point. I'm very much more concerned with students speaking truthfully and arguing for things that they believe in wholeheartedly, instead of, here's an argument, prove it, now disprove it, and do it beautifully, do it both ways. Like, that doesn't sit well with me. So
yeah, no, and that, what that is, it's almost like development is arrested in the logic phase, and so, I mean, you're learning to manipulate things, and manipulation is good, right? You're handling things, and that's great, but that's not the end of it, right? You're handling it for good, and if you can't see that good and go toward that good, then your development has been arrested, and often by your own will, right? You've decided that you'd rather be good at handling stuff than to be beautiful. Elsewhere in your teaching philosophy, you say, my first aim as a teacher is to do my best to learn about my students' souls and teach truth and truths within the full knowledge. So truth is capitalized, and then truths with the full knowledge of mankind's capacity for good and evil. My courses are structured around truth and meaning. The content presented within is simply the vehicle chosen for its beauty. And so, you clearly have this vision of eternity, and of the eternal significance of your work as a teacher and of the students' growth as a young Christian. And you've laid out some of that. I wonder if we could get a little more scholastic, a little more philosophical, I suppose. And I want to ask you what the soul is. How about that? That might be the dooziest of the doozies I've asked any teachers. What's the soul?
A really mean question.
Yeah, but you use the word so often. I just want to hear from you.
Does the teacher know what she's talking about? Who knows? I think there are several different ways of looking at it. I've taught the Phaedrus now for 6 or 7 years, and we take a pretty in-depth look at what Plato says the soul is there. And he says, ultimately, I mean, there's lots to go through there, but ultimately it is a thing that seeks, it pursues loves, right? And at the highest of the loves is kind of a love of philosophy. And so, but then you have this Christian understanding more so of the soul, where you have flesh and soul and spirit, and that the soul then becomes something that does try to attain higher things than what the body is going to aim for, but that the soul is part of you that is still not animated by Christ. It has to be trained to be animated by, to be moved by Christ. And so that's not a great response, because that didn't give a definition, but if we see the soul is moved by loves, according to Plato, that there are all kinds of different things that a soul can love, and that will cause a soul to move.
Yes, and that's such a theme in Lewis's work as well, right? Yeah. Coming from that, he was educated in
Yes.
that way. And so love, the impetus of love, the movement of love is a big deal for him.
Yeah. And that I think, right, because we have Lewis's, right, Man Without Chest, right? Like,
the abolition of man, and then the four loves, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, yeah, Lewis certainly has that in there. But even his Man with a Chest, right, is a man with a soul. It's a man with a rightly ordered soul. And to be really honest, I had never heard a good explanation of the difference between a soul and a spirit until a couple of months ago.
Oh yeah.
And,
okay.
And finally was able to say, okay, like I can get behind that kind of explanation. And it was essentially that, yes, the soul is animated by certain loves, but the only thing that is going to animate it in a higher way is going to be Christ. It has to be animated by the Holy Spirit in order for it to ever try to attain anything that's worth.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think it's interesting you say attain, and I think there's a temptation in Greek thinking and pagan thinking about the soul. There's a temptation towards a static sort of being. It's not automatically there, but I think that's a trajectory that presents itself, where the teleology and the direction of I just love how you speak teleologically, and how even your course is designed with an end in mind. It's taking you somewhere, and because the idea is for the Christian, animated by the Holy Spirit. Everyone has a mission. Like our life is a mission. So we're going out and we're going somewhere, and all of history is going out and going somewhere. And so, to be able to have that vision of movement, I think, and purposeful movement, I think is really vital.
Yeah, it really is so important, because if, particularly in our language, if you don't know where you're going with something, you're not ever going to get there. It doesn't matter how pretty it is or how many devices you've used. You have to know where you stand and what the thing is that you're aiming for.
Right.
In order for you to say it beautifully.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just going to be kind of
absolutely. Yeah. So you are so you've been a teacher and a classical Christian teacher for a while, but you are currently the director, the Rhetoric School Director at a school in Albuquerque, and so I assume that means you're the headmistress of the high school. Is that right?
That makes me sound really quite a lot fancier. So,
just admit it. Is that what that is?
So let's back up a little bit. So I stepped down from that position this past school year in order to homeschool my own children. So I am currently not the director of the Rhetoric School at a school in Albuquerque. I direct their mentor program, which is just a program within the Rhetoric School. Just something that was just enough to kind of keep my feet in the water. But at the time, yes, the director of the Rhetoric School was in charge of everything from discipline to curriculum to scope and sequence for the whole program. We, talking to teachers, doing parent trainings, train to the teachers, just did kind of a litany of things. Really enjoyed it, but needed to come home with something else to give my family. So
yes, and I get that, and we'll have to update your teacher profile. But the fact that you've moved to mentoring actually just reinforces the reason I wanted to bring it up and ask you. So it's you made that just fascinating comment about sobering students up as you teach rhetoric. And so then you have these high school age kids, and you're mentoring them. As a rhetoric teacher, I'd really like to hear about some of your experiences and some of the relationships you've had with students and families where you've seen personal growth, I guess we'll call it, through rhetoric.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So I think in the very beginning, the thing that really set me on this path was I had an experience where I really wasn't able to pour into a student the way that, like, a student came into the program very late in the game, and it was really difficult for everyone involved. I mean, for the student didn't love it, I didn't love it, because we were trying to fulfill an end that had not begun in the right spot.
Mm-hmm.
And it just reinforced for me how important it was that I really was able to myself speak winsomely to these students, and in a way that made sense to them, and in a way that really brought things down out of this high philosophical level and down into this matters. Like, this matters. When I go home today from school, the way that I talk to my parents, that's going to matter.
Yeah.
And so I've had some fantastic students that I've gotten to work with, and just seeing them move from, man, I really wasn't interested. The school that I taught at, our rhetoric trajectory started in 9th grade and doesn't finish until their senior year. And so they are in a rhetoric class every single year that they are in high school. And they, a lot of times, come into that thinking, man, this is going to be awful, because we're going to read some really boring stuff, and then I'm going to graduate. That's going to be it.
I have to talk holding my hands like this,
Yes. Yeah.
The whole time for 4 years.
Yes. Yeah. And so just to see some of them, especially in those early years when I was first starting to teach that trajectory, to have us struggle along together. When Aristotle starts talking about his categories, and everybody in the room is like, I have no idea what's going on. But like, I'm going to go read some more, and I'll get back with you guys. And so just to get to see several students move from that place of, man, this is awful, and I don't want to do this, to students who at the end, even for their senior thesis, are choosing projects that are rhetorically based, and saying, Mrs. Rogers, you changed the way that I think about the way I use my words.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm so much more careful with the things that I say, and even into things like social media, like getting students on social media and going, I can't even engage in social media anymore, Mrs. Rogers, because I can't be the person that I was. And I'm like, great, that's not a bad thing.
Not a bad thing. Yeah.
Yeah. You hang on to that. So
I really think that the rhetoric formation is really where you see the completion of a classical education, and one does see occasionally that part is neglected, or people will actually, students and families might even refuse to take that last step, and it really is kind of a tragedy, because that is the point where the student is able to, the word is such an important part of who we are.
Yeah.
And so to be able to take that last step and to take dominion through the word, and it is a bit of a, when I see that hasn't been done. And, of course, people have gifts, and some people have more natural talents. And some people get rhetoric from the moment they're born, right? And of course, everyone has has completion and formation to undergo. But like you said, it's not about the grade. And then just to see people not wish to is really a bummer. But it's great when you see that transformation happen. I have a suggested alternative title for your course, having heard this transformation, A Journey to Aristotle's Rhetoric from Awful to Awesome.
Oh yeah, there it is.
How about that one?
Right. Yes, that's right. Well, and I think that even, I mean, my life story, I mean, I'm not about to give it to you, but my life story is very much one of that, where I was a young child that absolutely was capable of speaking. Absolutely, it wasn't that I had speech issues or anything like that, and just chose not to for years at a time. Would just be like, yeah, I don't feel like talking to anybody, so I'm not going to.
So I have to ask you then how that changed. I don't need a life story, but how did that change happen?
No life story. It really happened when I went to grad school. And I sat in a room, and this has a little bit to do with my teaching philosophy too, because I talk some about bringing meaning to a classroom. But I went to grad school at the University of Dallas and had some fantastic teachers that I still keep in touch with. I loved my peers. I loved my professors. But I sat in those rooms for a couple of years and just sat there in awe. Like, I have no business being at this table. And by the end, and you have to finish the program out with a thesis, and it made a lot of sense to me to do a thesis on rhetoric. But given how silent I was as a child, I did my thesis on rhetoric and silence, and the place of silence within the rhetorical art. And so it wasn't until I finished that, because even through all of writing that, I thought, I don't have anything to say. Like, it has all already been said, and I don't have much to add to the conversation. But by the time I had graduated, I sat up and realized, in talking, you get into that kind of grad school mentality of like, everyone's always talking about these things, and that's all you're ever talking about. But you get back out into the real world, and I realized I really do have something to say. I have opinions, and I know that I can execute what I am trying to execute. And it really wasn't until I finished grad school that I kind of found a voice. And I think a lot of that has to do with the instruction that I had in rhetorical theory.
And how valuable is that? I mean, it's one of the the kind of the first things that gets put out there as what rhetoric offers for people. But I think we often think if at some point it will come, right? I'm going to become an adult at some point, and I'll find that voice. But I mean, from your own experience, or and from many others, like it's better for that to come early. And the fact that we'd rather have it happen when you're 15 than when you're 25. Instead of having to go through that arduous journey. So y'all, those of you who are watching, this is probably going to be your last chance to toss in any questions, and of course we welcome your comments. I would like, so if you guys look below the video you're watching, you'll see some of Mary Pat's profile, and then a link to her page on Kepler. So I encourage you to visit that and check out her class. But in that text, you'll see that her research focused on silence and rhetoric. And so hearing you talk about silence is really fascinating. And actually, so I think Daniel Fukushon is about to ask my question. He's just put up a comment. I would love to hear more about the role of silence in rhetoric. Exactly, that's my question, specifically in the context of such a noisy world of instant reactions. So I'd like to hear just some of your conclusions. But let's start with Daniel's question. Noisy world, role of silence.
So, shockingly, there are lots of books about silence and rhetoric out there. I've read a handful of them, and silence can be a particularly powerful tool when the world around you has been highly rhetoricized. That's not a word. But when there is a lot of noise, and rhetoric can get such a bad rap, especially in the modern political scene, rhetoric gets such a bad rap. And when everyone is trying to be heard, a lot of times it is in the absence of something where it's going to be really important to start looking and paying attention to why is there not anything there? Why is this person not saying anything? And sometimes that can be used in a really powerful way. The trick is that you have to have people that are paying enough attention to identify that that someone has been given the opportunity to speak, and they chose not to. Because there's lots of, I remember having a professor that said, okay, I need you to give me a definition for silence. This is before I'd even started writing. And I said, it's not speaking. And,
yeah. As soon as you said that, I was like, whoa, what is silence?
Yeah. And she grabbed me by the shoulders and she said, cling to that. Okay. Cling to that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm terrified. Okay. I'm clinging. Because there is just a rabbit hole of what silence could be that goes far beyond not speaking.
She was a wise woman.
Yes, she was. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Yeah. And so it does take a particularly, it takes thoughtful people to slow down and realize here is a place where someone has been given the opportunity to speak. And I think that that's important. People have to have the opportunity to speak, but they're choosing not to. And why are they choosing not to?
Yeah. Well, I confess that I haven't thought much about this topic, but it seems to me even something as elementary and mechanical in rhetoric, such as pacing, silence is a part of rhetoric even there. It's not a long period of silence, but you can't just be producing sound waves constantly, right? And of course, rhetoric is more than simply speech. Right? There's a lot of presentation and physical aspects, but it seems to me that pacing would be an early application of thinking about silence and rhetoric.
Yes, and that's certainly one of the areas that you can get into it. My work I did a lot of work with a Shakespearean play and spent more time than I care to admit on the meter and when meter was missing. It's just like it gets so, it's such a big field that really doesn't get the time of day in a lot of ways. But can be incredibly important, and getting students right, because even as you have students that are learning to grapple with rhetoric, getting them to understand, like you said, those pauses, those spaces where it is time for you to stop moving your mouth.
Yeah. It must be a golden moment when you as a teacher get to say those words.
No,
no, you would never. Yeah.
No, it's terrifying because they take it as, a lot of times students take it as, but I'm doing what you told, like I'm speaking.
Right.
And I'm getting through it. And there are beautiful words in here. And I have all of these schemes and all of these tropes. And I'm like, yes, I know, but you got to stop talking. Like, it's just.
Well, at that level of mastery, because, you come down in your own personal, in your own life, you had chosen to be silent, but you hadn't really, mastered rhetoric. But, it does seem that, as you begin to have a bit of mastery, that silence would have to be an integral part of it. Carla Memot shares, and Mark Twain, I mean, it just makes sense this is Mark Twain, because I imagine that silence would be a good way to mess with people rhetorically. One of Mark Twain's most famous speeches started with silence. He speaks of how he took silence to an uncomfortable level. The audience eventually responded with titters and laughter. Oh yeah, that is masterful control of the audience.
Yes, it is, that you can not say anything and still have them responding to you is such a big deal.
Yes. And Daniel makes a comment here that, it's just, one more. If you are around rhetoric teachers and rhetoric classes, you will see how integral rhetoric is in your life. It's just a part of life. So negotiators would agree with the effectiveness of the awkward silence. A question for you: is a platform of some kind a prerequisite to effective silence? That is, do you need to be able to say something in order for your silence to be meaningful?
I think that it plays a big role, because if you are not being given space to speak in the first place, you being quiet or you not saying anything isn't going to be noticed.
Right.
The examples that I found in my work were all, they happen to all actually be females. I didn't really intend that, but that's where
that is interesting.
And they all had a space to speak, and were actually asked to speak and didn't. And so you get that everywhere from courtrooms to Shakespeare to Queens, and you have all of these things happening where, they have a place where they can do something with language, and they opt not to for whatever reason.
So we'll make the sequel to this class something like The Rest is Silence.
Yes.
And you could just have a year of practicing silence before people graduate.
They would love that.
I'm sure. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about rhetoric, and I'll include silence within that. So we've talked about rhetoric this entire time. This class is absolutely a fascinating class, and there is a lot of our class titles, we have some plain class titles, biology, and then we might have titles that are much more glorious. I just love the journey that your class title took on me. I don't mean to make took me on. I don't mean to make too much hay of it and make you feel awkward about it, but I have to say, absolutely delighted me. And then talking to you and seeing that the content of the class is just as delightful as the title suggested. I'm looking forward to this year for you, and thank you for talking to us. Before you say goodbye, I was just seeing the comments popping up. So everyone is saying goodbye to you, Scott, Carla, other viewers. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, thanks again, Mary Pat.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun to be here and get to talk about stuff that I love, and I try not to do that with my family because they get like, oh, mom.
Yeah. So I'm glad we could be an outlet for you. You've got at least a week, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thanks again, and so long, everybody.
Yeah.